Good afternoon, everyone. To everyone who's Black on this call, thank you for waking up today and opening your eyes. That is a revolutionary act, and I appreciate that from you today. My name is Chelsea Jackson. I'm from the fascist United States of America. I was born there, but I hail from Decatur, from outside of Atlanta. And I just want to speak the name of the Chickasaw people because those are the lands that I was raised on. I was raised on those people's lands, and just want to clearly say that every time I speak Atlanta. So my background quickly is I'm a political scientist by training, which means I look at systems, how systems work, how people are, everything from elections to legislation to the organization. And particularly my research area is the intersections of crime, race, and politics. So in America, that's basically everything, but specifically to look at the criminal justice system. In looking at the history of the American criminal justice system, there is no institution, but especially not a punitive one, that is not based in chattel slavery and the basis of America as a colony of the United Kingdom intended to bear wealth, bear fruit for the queen. So in recognizing that the first police officers, before there were ever police officers organized in any way, were slave patrols, which were actually just armed white militiamen, much like the men who killed Ahmaud Arbery or Tamir Rice, a sort of self-empowered security guard of whiteness. And that morphs the slave patrol, which role is, these are people who don't own slaves, so they're not making money off of slavery. But their role in maintaining Black enslaved people as inferior, as unhuman, as property, reified their humanity in their own eyes as maybe a yeoman farmer who doesn't own anything and is living on, a cotton plantation, but at least I'm not the enslaved person. So when we move from slave patrols and into the resistance of Black people, every time we speak about Black death, I want to speak about Black resistance, because often we talk and mourn George Floyd, we mourn Tony McDade, we mourn Tamir Rice, we mourn Mike Brown, but we don't talk about the Ferguson uprising, right? And in many ways, Black resistance stands in the history of America right up next to every single institution, which is why I say abolition is the politics of our ancestors. So to quickly trace that from Black anti-slavery abolitionists, from Frederick Douglass to David Walker, writing as early as 1830, who's calling out the clear contradictions in the American Declaration of Independence and making an open call to all Black people across the world, not just in America, not just in the colonies, but in 1830, he writes this open call across the world to take up arms in defense of their brethren and who are enslaved, and to overthrow this fake democracy, which is the United States of America. Now, to trace from 1830 going into the life of Frederick Douglass in the 1850s and 1860s, that was David Walker, just to clarify that, colored appeal to the colored peoples of the world. So to move into the resistance on the plantation, the resistance of a slave rebellion, Nat Turner was an abolitionist. Nat Turner was a revolutionary. And Nat Turner was also called a murderer, a rioter, someone who incited violence, an insurrectionist, right? An outside agitator, right? But Nat Turner was a pastor who understood that the reality of even the theology he was being taught on the plantation, the spirituality he was being given was filtered through anti-Blackness and racism. And he looked to the Jesus who flipped the tables in the market and said, violent uprising, violent resistance to oppression, murder, rape, brutalization is not wrong. And that history and that legacy has been lost and sort of watered down in the post-civil rights movement. So quickly to move through the civil rights movement, and I know I'm jumping a little bit, but to get to the civil rights movement, it's important to understand that police, before they were police, once they became police, have never not killed Black people in America. They've never not brutalized Black people in America. And Black people in America have never not resisted violently, enthusiastically, in the streets, in protests, in all different forms. So we can look back to the 1920s where Black men are being lynched after they're returning home from fighting in World War I, and the NAACP running silent marches through the streets of New York City, thousands and thousands of Black people waving banners that say a man was lynched today, right? So the images that we're seeing today in over 350 American cities, where you see signs like "Stop killing us," "I can't breathe," "Black Lives Matter," these movements, this is not new. We're in 2020, and in 1920, Black people were doing this, and in 1820, Black people were doing this, and in 1720, Black people were doing this. So Harold Cruz, in his book, Rebellion or Revolution, which I'll recommend to folks, he talks about the historical discontinuity of many of our movements and much of our resistance against white supremacy, against capitalism, against dehumanizing people and extracting everything from them and treating them as disposable, which is what our prisons do, which is what our criminal justice system does, which is what an education system that trains our children to obey and not to imagine does. And so in the United States, when we have these structures set up that have been set up and have morphed since slavery, but have maintained, the first prisons in the United States were slave auctions. So it's not to say that every prison, every police department in the United States has an outgrowth of slavery, because we understood that it wasn't present in all territories, but that the baseline of repression and control that comes from American policing comes from the idea that you cannot have people that you stole against their will, who you forced to work and labor and toil, who you murder and exploit, to walk around freely without an armed guard to keep them in place. And that is the fact of the matter. When you establish land on a genocidal land, I would encourage people to just Google the history of the Texas Rangers. That's a genocide squad that was created to literally exterminate indigenous folk. So when we look at the history of these institutions, we have to understand policing, in particular American policing, was designed to murder and kill, oppress, brutalize, sexually assault. And I'm sorry, I'm using very triggering language here, and I didn't do a warning before this, but the reality is that Black Lives Matter has been on the breath of my great grandmother Victoria, as she was beaten to death on a Jamaica slave plantation, nearly to death before she was transported to Mississippi. They took her to Jamaica to break her first because she was too resistant. She had that abolitionist spirit that wouldn't allow her to sit still and take, well, at least I'm alive. No, I want to be free. So finally, to kind of transition out, I want to move to a critique of sort of the celebrity culture and the Black centrist and also the Democratic sort of liberal co-optation that's going on. As Kay mentioned, I want to raise the name of Elder Angela Davis, and I was rereading her book, Abolition, Democracy. Another great one, especially if you want to learn about the trajectory of prison abolition to slavery abolition. This is a great book. But in this book, she says that we can't be surprised when we're getting co-opted. We have to expect it. So we can't be surprised now that the mayor of DC has painted a huge Black Lives Matter in front of the White House, and yet she voted for $19 million to go to the DC Police Department for this fiscal year. We can't be surprised. But the reality is Black Lives Matter is not about outrage about Black death. Black Lives Matter is about outrage and fight and resistance and fire and every tool, every arrow in our quiver for the freedom and justice and liberation of Black people. And the last thing I wanted to do is quickly read just 3 points from the Black Lives Matter website of what we believe. The reason I want to read this is because it traces back to W.E.B. Du Bois's Pan-Africanism. It traces back to Marcus Garvey. It traces back to Malcolm X. It traces back to Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael. And they say, we are unapologetically Black in our positioning, Black power. In affirming that Black Lives Matter, we do not need to qualify our position. To love and desire freedom and justice for ourselves is a prerequisite for wanting the same for others. Black Lives Matter is not about putting cops in cages. Black Lives Matter is not about indicting cops. Black Lives Matter is not about getting cops fired. Black Lives Matter is about freedom and justice for Black people. And there is no justice in a cage. There is no justice in a statute book where every crime that's listed can only be committed by an individual against another individual. That's not a basis of justice. And so that's not what Black Lives Matter is about. The second point, we see ourselves as part of the global Black family, and we are aware of the different ways we are impacted or privileged as Black people who exist in different parts of the world. This line hits so hard for me as a Black woman who was born in America, who's currently in the UK. I now openly identify as an African woman whose ancestors were stolen. But for me, wrestling with my nation being in a period of rebellion, of uprising, of my people, my comrades, literally right now, washing tear gas out of their eyes. And I'm sitting in Oxford. How can I wrestle with the privilege? How can I wrestle with this space and the fact that I am a part of the global Black family and that folks here are screaming Black Lives Matter? And we know from Belly Muhinga, right, that Black women are not safe, just like Breonna Taylor wasn't safe, right? So the connections that we see, the legacy of resistance connects us, not the legacy of oppression. The history of white people oppressing us is not what unites Black people in America, in the UK, across Europe, across the continent of Africa, across Caribbean and the Latin American nations. What unites us is a history of resistance. What unites us is imagining a world that is more, that is better, a freedom, a democracy, a justice that's not couched in individualism, but that really understands the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. It takes a village to raise a child. We are all in this together. So in this moment, it's easy to remember the names, Tony McDade, George Floyd, to talk about the individuals. But I refuse to allow liberal media or sound bites or Twitter or trying to fit very complex ideas into short space of time to allow me to shrink Black rebellion and Black resistance into a few days of protest, into a few cities, into a few killings, into a few into a few calls to divest, into a few calls to arrest a few officers, into a few calls to investigate a few departments. This is a collective problem, and we have collective solutions. So I thank everyone. I don't want to keep talking, but I just love you so much, everyone on this call, and I'm so thankful for these freedom fighters at CAPE and No Exclusions who organized this space, and just for allowing me to be here in community with you all and build. So thank you. I'm thinking of just a lot of violence prevention organizations and gun buyback programs, particularly in Chicago and in New York City. And if you just look up like gun buyback, violence prevention, domestic violence prevention, Brooklyn, New York, because I don't want to misstate the name. But I know in Atlanta that growing up, especially like coming up in the movement as a student activist, we had our own security. and they're called the Street Groomers. You can look them up. Street Groomers Atlanta. It was started by this guy. I don't remember his name, but when I tell y'all he's almost 7 feet tall, like he uses his physical ability and he goes into communities and works with low risk, young folk who may be a little rambunctious, may have tempers, may, you know what I'm saying, get in fights in the neighborhood, and he helps them to channel that. And so the name Street Groomers, it comes from the fact that they actually like pick up trash and organize and clean up neighborhoods, but they also serve as protection from anyone, from your grandma who's walking to the store in that neighborhood on the east side near Gresham Road, to when we had protests, when the police were being wild, when we, were doing a sit-in or a die-in or whatever, and the Street Groomers would make a box around us. So I want to lift up the fact that, and as I think it was Lola who said earlier, that communities who've already been excluded from being protected by the police are already coming up with ways to protect themselves. So I think in a lot of ways, for me, growing up as a Black woman in America, I saw daily abolition in practice. It just wasn't called that because that theory and that language wasn't there. But in the reality, we knew that we had a few guys in the neighborhood that you would call if somebody was out. And now I'm sharing abolition graphics that say, isn't that what abolition looks like? So, I just wanted to raise the Street Groomers, violence prevention, and gun buyback programs in Chicago. In high places. One of my favorite kind of quotes going around social media right now is, most Black faces in high places are more loyal to the high places than to the Black faces, right? Now, and I'm gonna try to be quick with this story, but my background as being a Black woman from Atlanta, which is considered the Black Mecca of America, which has had a Black mayor continually since 1970, which we've had Black women mayors that have won international awards, but that same mayor closed every single public housing unit in the city. We talked about the 1996 Olympics, which is looked at as, oh, this Black leadership, and they have the Olympics in their city, but they locked up all the poor and homeless and folks that was out and didn't have access to housing. They demolished more than half of Peoplestown to build the Centennial Olympic Park. So me growing up in Atlanta and knowing the history of Atlanta and how classist and racist and how capitalism will get in the bed with racism, and they'll just have a great party at the expense of the least powerful, the least, and when I say powerful, I don't mean real power, right? Because people power, we all have that power. Disabled folks are not less powerful. You know what I'm saying? Trans folks are not less powerful. That's not what I'm saying. But in the confines of, the system that we work in, the people whose power is stripped from them, let's say that those folks always bear the brunt. So my homeboys who get pulled over by the police in America every single day, Barack Obama's 8-point platform of kill 72% less Black people. Look, because my homies that I'm concerned about every single day, just leaving their house. And me living in the UK, I live in Oxford, which I joke to my partner all the time. I live in a police bubble, because if there's anywhere in this country where even as a Black woman, I'm gonna have the least contact with police, it's gonna be on the campus of the Imperial University. So, but even in that experience, like racial profiling, all these other things. So as a Black woman from America who's here, to listen to the birthplace of the racism, of the white supremacy, of the colonial logics, of the violence, of the imperialism, of the war, of the capitalism, have the audacity to talk about America. It's just, so sorry, the last thing I want to say is actually much more positive, and it's advice to people that are listening. One of the number one things that I find frustrating is people think that being an abolitionist or fighting for racial justice, being an anti-racist, means you have to be an activist. Let's be clear. I'm an activist, and I'm pretty sure everybody else on this call is an activist out of necessity and literally like if I don't do this, I'm going to die because I have to help my people not die, right? I don't want to do this. Like, being an activist is not what people should be devoting their lives to, is eliminating systems of oppression. So if you have this mindset that because you're not an activist, you can't say anything, you are the reason why we can't sleep. You are the reason why we're staying up till 4 o'clock in the morning. You are the reason why I have so many emails in my inbox that I haven't responded to. You are the reason why people are trying to connect, are trying to sleep, are trying to love themselves and just survive. Someone earlier said that, you know, people are grieving while you're learning. So the reality of this moment is nobody's supposed to be an activist because we all supposed to be free. So help me stop being an activist. Help me stop writing about. So no, you don't have to be a scholar who studied everything I've studied to talk about police and prisons and race. No, I don't want to study it anymore. Help me stop. And the way that you do that is every single profession, every single neighborhood, every single person, you can be abolitionists doing that. We have an abolitionist teacher on the line. We have abolitionist folks who are working with survivors, who you can do anything. You're a janitor, be an abolitionist janitor. Somebody calls the security guard where you work, stand up. You know what I'm saying? Stand in that and say, actually, do we need to call security? I think they were fine. If you're a barista and you have a coworker who never puts the right milk in Black people's coffee, call her out. And I know I'm using these very micro level examples, but I do that to put people at ease. So you don't feel like, oh my gosh, I need to go organize an action in London where 500 people come. Please don't do that, because you don't know anything about organizing anything and you won't keep those folks safe. So get in where you fit in, do where you can. Everyone can be an abolitionist. Everyone can be anti-racist. And yes, you have to do the reading. Yes, you have to dig in your pockets. And yes, you have to listen to people who know more than you, but that's life.